Today's Mishnah will probably at some point raise your blood pressure, but try to stay calm.
236.
Okay, we're at the top of page 236, right? And we are watching the sort of expansion of rabbinic discourse, in that, if you remember several weeks ago, we looked at a Mishnah. From Shimon HaTzadik, the Simon the Righteous. And he laid out what he called the sort of the three cornerstones of Jewish life. That the world exists on the basis of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. Study, worship, and acts of loving kindness. And part of what we're seeing in last week's Mishnah and in this week's Mishnah is the sages here are sort of focusing on an aspect of that tripartite paradigm and expanding it into a wider world applicability. Okay. So our teacher, Yosef ben Yochanan of Jerusalem, liked to say, let your house be open wide, let the poor be as members of your household, and do not speak at length with women. Now you know why I said somebody's blood pressure was going to get a little elevated, right?
A little?
Right? Like I said, we're gonna look at that one a little bit more. But before we do, I just want to note that the rest of this Mishnah, the rest of the stuff that's here, is actually a later gloss where someone already felt the need to comment on the last part of the Mishnah.
Is this where the separation of women and men is based on in synagogue?
No, it was before this. It was way before this. Right? And so the person who adds this gloss, it's not clear whether it's Rabbi Yehuda, who's the compiler of the Mishnah, or whether it was added to the Mishnah even earlier. But they're explaining what it is that Yosef ben Yochanan meant. He meant this in reference to a man's own wife, but how much the more so should it apply to another's wife? On this bit, and then we have a kind of a gloss on the gloss.
Right.
On this basis, the sages said, whenever a man speaks at length with women, he brings evil upon himself, deprives himself of time spent delving into Torah matters, and eventually ends up in hell. Okay. This is not the most flattering comment you're going to come across with regard to interactions between men and women. But I want you to park that over here for a minute, because I'd like to try to get the rest of the Mishnah under our belts first, because it will impact on how many of the various commentators read the last clause. Okay, so let's look at the first couple of parts. All right. Let your house be open wide. All right. And revach in Hebrew usually implies a certain benefit, that you are the beneficiary of some largesse, which I think the author of the Mishnah here is suggesting that your house should be the place which is a place of largesse and generosity to those to others.
What's the word largesse mean?
In this kindness,
Okay,
expansiveness,
okay, thank you.
right? That the idea that one should demonstrate hospitality as a virtue for its own sake by being open to a wide range of guests. Right? And the commentators, for example, Ovadia Bartanura, who I'll tell you more about in a few minutes, says this, and he points to the stories of Abraham, both the ones in the Bible and the ones in the Midrash that talk about how open his tent was, that he welcomed everybody. And in fact, there's this Midrash that talks about how he had a large tent with 4 doors, one on each side, so no one should have to trouble themselves to go around to find their way in. And what's intriguing is that Mahzor Vitri, again, I'll tell you more about Mahzor Vitri in a moment, but attaches that same legend to a different biblical character, namely Job. Right? Job is seen as a model of generosity, which is why he's so rewarded by God, so that he has all of this stuff which the Holy One can allow Satan to mess with. Right? Right? But the idea is that one should, in fact.
There's somebody at the door. Oh, and then that's what.
Oh, did Robin leave already? I didn't see her go. Oh, and I will hang up the phone so that you don't keep hearing the ringy ringies.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay, please. Welcome. Find an empty seat, and we are on page 236 at the top of the page. Well, she can have the second book in case she wants to read it a second time.
Okay. A wonderful child.
So it's clear that the idea of hospitality is the underlying current here. And the idea is that your home should be a place which benefits others to the capacity that you are capable. And that it should not be limited, whereas in the previous Mishnah, our teacher focused it on sages being part of your household, that it should sort of become like a Torah annex, if you will, or a Torah study annex. Here, it's a much broader, inclusive model.
Is that like Socrates and the philosophers?
Yes. Understand that the rabbis were very aware of what was going on in the Hellenistic world around them. So whether they cite them or not, or whether they just find resonance in certain cultural models that exist, it is a given. I mean, last week, I think we talked a little bit about the whole question of Hellenism in Jewish Palestine, because there's just a lot of it. You know, the Hellenistic world was the predominant culture of the era from about a century and a half before the Maccabees, until you have this transformation of the of the Roman Empire into the Holy Roman Empire in the early 4th century.
Thank you.
Yes, Barbara.
Our Siddur translates it as to open it to the poor, because this
In the
is
second clause.
In the first one is just open wide. Remember, these are all 3-step kinds of statements. So step 1 is open wide to everyone. We're gonna look in a second as at the expansion of let the poor be as members of your household.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, because the reality is that while we might be open to having guests and company and people in our homes. Whether we are as open to having people who are in real need is a different story. There, this is a slight digression, but bear with me for a second. There's an organization which many of you, if not all of you, have heard of called Mazon. Mazon was created in the 1980s by Leonard Fine of blessed memory. And Mazon, which is the Hebrew word for food, Mazon was created as a Jewish response to hunger. And one of their pilot projects was to try to get people to do a modern version of a custom that proliferated in Eastern Europe, especially in certain towns and communities. There was in Lithuania and the surrounding areas, recognizing that the borders of all those countries were kind of fluid. There was the Council of the Four Lands, and the Council of the Four Lands was a rabbinic group that had a tremendous amount of weight and authority over religious practice within the territories under its hegemony. And I'm going to use the word enforced, but that might be a little overstated. They enforced the idea that when you had a simcha, you're supposed to set places at the table for people who are needy. Whereas today we might just have, open seating. But let's say you were having a wedding and you were inviting 100 guests. The rule was you had to have, I don't remember what the exact number was, but there was a percentage number of poor places that had to be set up relative to the number of guests you wanted to have. So if you had 100 guests, let's say it was 10 people. If it was 200 guests, you wanted to have 20 people. Right? There was a ratio that you had to maintain, and they were very serious about it. And obviously, as we moved into modernity, that became less and less practical in many ways, and not the way simchas were done. So Mazon tried to capture the spirit of it by encouraging people when they had a simcha, whether it was a birthday party or a bar mitzvah or a wedding or whatever. They encouraged people to make a donation of 3% of the cost of the simcha to Mazon. Obviously, Mazon was happy to take less than 3%, but they had to establish some sort of target, and so that became the target. And the idea was, we're not setting places for the poor at our party on Saturday night, because how are you even going to go about the mechanics of inviting them and limiting the number and blah, blah, blah. It was just, okay, so this was sort of Leonard Fine's brilliant model for reinvigorating an ancient practice and sharing at a moment of simcha with those in need. So part of what the author of our Mishnah is doing to bring, I know it was a digression, but it made sense. The idea that it's not just that you open your house to sages and to scholars and to people of means or your friends, but the idea is that you should make it open to those in need. And one of the interesting comments that I came across in several of the commentaries was not one that I expected at all, but they write essentially as follows, that one should minimize the number of slaves one owns, and some of them are tie it to the idea that Jewish slave owners usually owned non-Jewish slaves. And some of them said, well, and you don't want too many of those Canaanites and other ites in your household because that's not a good model. But they said, what should you do instead? That you should minimize your slave ownership in favor of employing poor fellow Jews. Right? So he's taking it not as guests, but as members of your household, right? Employed members of your household, but as a way of providing them with financial stability. I have to admit, until I prepared for today's class and I found that this little strand of commentary, I'd never read that this way. But it's a fascinating idea because the commentators focus on what does it mean to be b'nei veitecha, members of your household. And not treated in a sort of a metaphoric sort of way that when you have guests who are poor, you treat them the same, with the same niceness, quote unquote, that you treat your own family and friends. I'm not leaving, I'd love to figure out some way to do that remotely, but that is, oh, I'm sorry. That is beyond my capacity. Okay. So just so we are clear, Yosef ben Yochanan seems to be focusing a lot of his attention on creating a home in which hospitality is expressed and reflected, and that while you would possibly have servers in your household, if you're going to engage others, engage those who will benefit from that employment. I'm not sure if it's quite the same as, teach a person to fish, but it's sort of in that same idea of providing people or helping them meet their need. Okay. Now, what do we make of this last stick, which on the surface seems unrelated to what goes before it, right? But we have to posit, at least somewhat, that Yosef ben Yochanan did not all of a sudden come up with a complete non sequitur, right? It just doesn't make sense that, well, hospitality, inclusion, la la la. Don't talk to your wife too much. It's like there's a disconnect. Not just the fact that it sounds a little misogynistic. Well, maybe even a lot misogynistic.
Our book says small talk, and small talk is just kind of meaningless talk or.
Yes, and we're going to come back to that model in a second. So I'm glad you caught that. Barbara?
I was thinking that it was a reference back to Adam and Eve. That Eve corrupted Adam by talking to him.
Interesting. It's still not very flattering. Though I have to admit,
wasn't Eve criticized for having gotten us thrown out of the Garden of Eden?
Well, yes,
along
but
with the snake.
yes, but I think that's much more of a Christian line of understanding than it is a Jewish line of understanding, because Adam is held accountable for his own actions by God. Right? If you remember the story, God comes along and says, where is everybody? And Adam goes, I was hiding in the bushes. Right? God's going like, so why were you hiding in the bushes? Well, I was naked. And God says, how do you know you were naked? Who told you that you were naked? And that's when he says, well, she gave me the fruit, and therefore it's her fault. And in fact, you gave her to me, so it's really your fault, right? Adam is passing the buck.
Typical man.
God turns to Eve and says, what did you do? It's not my fault. The snake made me do it, and you created the snake, so it's on you. Okay, God is not impressed. Right? Does not even bother asking the snake any questions, but the punishments are now being meted out to the snake, to Eve, and to Adam. Right? Because the excuses are ephemeral or worse. And any parent knows that whatever it is that the kid did that got them in trouble manifests less anger and punishment when there's a I did it confession as opposed to denials and all the blaming and not me and no, I was I was kidnapped by aliens. That's why I missed curfew. Yeah, right. Okay. My watch stopped. You know, but we've all experienced this. And at a certain point, it's like, if you own what you did wrong, the consequences, while they're still there, are not as because we are not as miffed that, our child is trying to blow one past us because they think we're idiots with some of the crazy excuses that they come up with, or passing of the buck of blame. So, and in fact, in Christianity, the vilification of women that emerges from the story of the garden is horrible. The ultimate deceiver and temptress and you name it, you name the negative imagery, that's in there. In a way that could only have been created by a bunch of men who were trying to do what Adam did, which is get himself off the hook by blaming Eve. There may be an element of that, but I'm not sure that that's what's driving it. But I can't say for sure what is driving it. I'm just going to give you some of the theories that I aggregated in preparation for today. Okay, so in some particular order, right? Rashi, and I'm just going to.
Fine.
Just choking, but I'm fine.
Some more?
Who's
No,
got
thanks.
tissue?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I will identify the various sages and sources for you a little bit, not in overly great detail, but I just want to sort of give you a sense of who's talking about what, right? Rashi, who is probably the most famous of the people on our list, with possibly one exception, was a French rabbi who authored a remarkably comprehensive commentary both to the Bible and to the Talmud. He was born in Troyes, which is in France. He studied in Worms, which was in Germany, or the Germany precursor, because Germany didn't exist back then. And he often brings rabbinic or early rabbinic perspective. And basically what he says is it's all about temptation. Right? That engaging in small talk is a prelude or a pathway to other activities. And he's reading it in some ways through the prism of the next part of it, which says that if one should be careful in one's conversation with one's spouse, how much more so in idle conversation with other women. And yes, there is that strand of women as temptress, but there's also, since it's applied, at least by most of the commentators, to the person's own spouse, there's got to be more to it than just that. And so you have sources like Ovadia Bar Tanura, the guy for whom the wine is named, because he was the vintner. And he was a 15th century Italian rabbi who is until the wine, was most well known for his commentary to the Mishnah. And part of what he tries to explain is what's the temptation if one is talking about engaging in conversation with one's own spouse. Right? I might be able to at least see the applicability to, the female population beyond one's household. And so Bartanura introduces the idea that it tries to create a bifurcation between engaging in conversations of any kind with your spouse normally versus when your wife is in a state of ritual impurity. She's menstruating and she has not gone to the mikvah yet, right? Which means that, conversation can turn to other forms of activity which are prohibited because she's in a state of ritual impurity. So that's how Bartanura tries to solve the matter of why would it be prohibited to engage in conversation with your spouse? Because it might lead down the path of temptation, which would otherwise be fine with your own spouse, but in this particular time frame is prohibited. Did you have your hand
I
up?
had my hand up because your parents would say, you could spend your time much better if you did the following. If you didn't watch as much TV and spend more time studying, how smart you might be. This is study of Torah. So rather than have this idle chit chat, you can spend more time studying Torah.
Right, but remember that that's the gloss on the gloss.
The gloss on the gloss, right?
Right.
Well,
So on one level, it's a later attempt to explain why engaging in conversation with your spouse is bad, right? So Bartanura sort of suggests that, it's because the conversation can lead to temptation, which leads to a violation of ritual purity, and that's a bad thing,
okay.
right?
That's far-fetched.
Well, it is and it isn't, I suppose. But remember, he's trying to make sense of something that he's not getting so well. All right. Next, all right. Mahzor Vitri, before that, Avot de Rabbi Natan. Avot de Rabbi Natan is the first and longest of the minor tractates of the Talmud. Right? The Talmud is primarily made up of 63 tractates, so that if you looked at a printed version on the shelf and you counted up the number of tractates that were listed it's usually about a 20-volume set. Some smaller ones are aggregated, larger ones get their own volume. But it was but there's also a whole bunch of what are minor tractates, which are not included in that 20-volume set and are very often harder to access. They include tractates that deal with tzitzit, tractates that deal with writing a Torah scroll. There are some that deal with matters of mourning and loss. There are, and amongst those is this work called Avot de Rabbi Natan, which seems to have been compiled somewhere between the years 700 and 900 of the Common Era, so during the Gaonic period. And in some ways, it serves almost like a commentary to our tractate of Avot, right? Hence the name Avot de Rabbi Natan. It's connected. The tractate of Avot does not have any Gemara to it. So the Talmud is made up of two major parts, the Mishnah, which is completed around the year 200 or so, and then the discussion on the Mishnah that happens for the next 2 to 3 centuries until it too is sort of put into book form and finalized, and then they start commenting and discussing that. But when we talk about Talmud, we're talking about part A, the Mishnah, and part B, the Gemara. The tractate of Avot does not have any Gemara. So there are a number of scholars who are suggesting that the coalescence of all this material, which parallels, embellishes, adds to, at times disagrees with, is the functional equivalent of the Gemara to the tractate of Avot. Right? But it's a fascinating collection of material. But embedded in Avot de Rabbi Natan, and then echoed by Machzor Vitri, which is an 11th century prayer book that contains, aside from prayers, rules for prayer, and is composed by Rabbi Simcha of Vitry, who was a French scholar and a student of Rashi. So a lot of Machzor Vitri contains the rulings and opinions of Rashi on the question of prayer. Avot de Rabbi Natan and Machzor Vitri say the reason one should avoid too much conversation is, and it's focused on a certain type of conversation. Don't come home and tell your spouse all about the things that happened to you at work that bothered you, the interactions that you had, right? And it's interesting that none of them mentioned this, but they talk about how that kind of stuff will have one of two effects. It can lead to increased conflict or strife because your wife may then just rile you up and egg you on. And I'm reading this and I'm going like, this is Zeresh. All right. You're all going, who the hell is Zeresh? All right. Zeresh is perhaps better known as Mrs. Haman. All right. Zeresh is really, Haman comes home and he's all upset and she's going like, jerk, idiot, moron, do something. You're the vizier. You've got the power. Make this guy suffer. Go to the king, tell him to hang, da 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 da. All right. She's the sort of the voice behind the Haman agenda, if you will. And we know how that doesn't really end up going particularly well for Haman, right? But and when he comes back the next time and he's sort of, and she's going like, no, you Mormon, right? Which leads to the second concern that is articulated in Avot de Rabbi Natan and Machzor Vitri, which is that by telling your wife about how you're being bested at work or in the shul or in some other venue by these other people, if she doesn't do the Zeresh sort of push you to act badly, no, she will internalize the fact that you're a schmo. All right. Well, maybe they're all right. Maybe he really is a yold of some kind. Maybe he really isn't such a great husband. Blah 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 blah. And the conversation leads to a diminishment of the opinion of the wife with regard to her husband, who now internalizes all of this negative stuff and then reflects it. Right? Now, I'm not going to comment on whether I think they are right or not, at least not yet. But one has to appreciate the creativity of our sages who are trying to figure out, why does Rabbi Yosef ben Yoezer say this in this context? What is it? I don't get it. All right, and the truth is, I'm not sure that they really address that question particularly well. So we come to our next teacher, right? Abravanel, all right? Abravanel, Isaac ben Yehuda Abravanel, 1437 to 1508. He's born in Lisbon in Portugal into one of the oldest and most distinguished Jewish families on the Iberian Peninsula. And he is a statesman for the Jewish community. He's a philosopher, he's a financier, and he's a biblical commentator. And he writes, includes in his commentaries that he writes a commentary to the Tractate of Avot, or at least a partial one. And he writes that, and he at least is bringing us back to the context of the whole Mishnah, where he says, one should minimize one's conversations with one's spouse regarding matters of tzedakah or hachnasat orchim, hospitality, as women tend to be more frugal. Right? And I'm translating a little generously. He's a little less kind than the word frugal. But he's also maybe tapping into a reality, which is the woman who's in charge of the household knows what's in the kitchen and what groceries cost. And it's very nice, dear husband of mine, that you brought home 7 guests for dinner, but no, just like, no, you can't do that. Right? So Abravanel has at least brought us back to, and he and some of the others that follow that same path talk about, look at the story of Abraham when the 3 visitors show up. What does Abraham do? He invites them in and he promises them, and he runs into the house and he says to Sarah, quick, grab some of the finest flour and make bread so that I can serve our guests. And then he goes off to the herds and he finds a nice animal and right? What's the conversation between him and Sarah? It's completely one-sided. He doesn't say, am I interrupting what you're doing? Do I want your... No, it's like... Now, it's probable that this was not the first time Abraham had done this. And Sarah was like, oh, yeah, all right. And we know that Abraham and Sarah were blessed with a fair measure of affluence. So it was perhaps less of a concern. And well, he says it to Sarah, Sarah can turn around and outsource the actual work to any number of household attendants. But Abravanel is sort of looking at it and going like, this is a non-conversation conversation. And when it comes to matters of monies, women tend to be, by his estimation, more conservative. And therefore, you shouldn't ask too many questions. Don't engage them in conversation about this sort of stuff because there's going to be pushback. And you don't want pushback. And I get it on one level. Jody will tell you that I have on more than one occasion brought someone home for a meal on Shabbat or Yom Tov. It doesn't faze her. When I can, if I know that I've invited someone and it's not yet Shabbat or festival, I'll call her and warn her. But oftentimes it's like, I'll walk through the door and just FYI, I have company.
And she outsources it.
Not really. We don't have that many people to outsource it to. But the other thing is that she can't really get overly upset with me because before Jody and I were Jody and I, it was my first year at my shul in New Jersey, and it was Sukkot. And as Kiddush is ending, I asked Jody if she had anywhere to go for lunch to be in the sukkah. She said no. I said, fine, you come home with me. All right. Now I didn't understand what that was going to mean down the road but at that point it was like, we're having 4 guests, we'll have 5 guests. There's all, it was never an issue to add more people, whether in the sukkah or around the dining room table or whatever. So I guess because I set the pattern with her as an early guest, she can't really object when I bring home other surprise
No,
guests.
she's used to you and she just makes stuff that's stretchable
Yeah,
or extra.
leftovers are never an issue in our household. Getting tired of leftovers can sometimes be an issue, but having leftovers is rarely an issue.
Rabbi, I was thinking like over the years or centuries, I would say, I would guess that early, thought about talking to women about what, affairs of the workplace or outside the house, would have something to do. It's a real sociological problem that's come with us all these centuries, but it was even more so then, because if you think about it, how much could a woman get out of the tent or the house in ancient times to study Torah or what
Okay,
Torah was available, or the affairs of the world?
Okay,
So what was left to them might have been like, okay, this is my world. This is Mrs. So and so, or I hear this or that or that. And
so I'm going to explode that a little
go
bit
ahead.
because I think we may have a little bit of a recency bias. Okay? But in the Hellenistic world, free women had a large standing in the community. In the same way that free men had free men and free women in Hellenistic society had a large role. So I don't know that I can completely agree with that model. I think that may represent much more of a medieval transformation. And so when a Bravanel is doing it, he might be speaking from, the reality of the Iberian Peninsula, but from the Middle Ages, right? We sometimes look at the role and status of women and how it's changed in the last century, right? And yes, women were in the workplace in various formats in the pre-modern era.
And they did finally get the vote, didn't they?
Yeah, but
I'd like to push back just a little bit about, I don't recall any philosophical leaders in women in Greek times. Not that there weren't people who had certainly the capability, but their opportunity to attend a salon or a place where they could, talk about or argue about these things was nil.
that's true to a degree, especially if you look at the product of that society. But interwoven into that, we know that there was an engagement in that you have if you remember the story of the Shunammite woman in the book of Kings, all right? And after the child that they're blessed with by Elisha falls ill, she goes to one of the servants, get me a donkey, I gotta go see the prophet. And what does her husband say to her? Why are you going to the prophet today? It's not Shabbos. It's not Rosh Chodesh. It's not the new moon. Why are you going today? As opposed to your regular times of going, which meant that women routinely found themselves in the place where the prophet preached. All right. We also know that in the rabbinic period of this era, it was not uncommon for women to go listen to rabbis who did the circuit and preached on Shabbat.
What time period was this?
This is the first few centuries. You know, there's even a story about this one man who is really upset because his wife comes home late and lunch is either cold or burned. I don't remember exactly the way the story spins it. And he's really, really angry, and he's upset because where was his wife? Listening to Rabbi Meir on Shabbos morning, wherever he was preaching, right? Where was the husband? Not with listening to Rabbi Meir. He was waiting home for his lunch, right? And
This makes my point, I would think.
well, no, but it Dafka makes the reverse point, which is she is in the venue where she gets to study Torah. And she goes regularly to hear
Right.
the
Right.
sages preaching. They might not have been particularly welcome in the house of study, but that was a limited venue, even for the ordinary male. It was more accessible to them, but it was still limited.
Mhm.
But it seems clear that women were, women went to shul, for lack of a better term.
I would say you could find exceptions to the rule, but the rule was women were in the house. I mean, and you can see that in Islamic culture right now. In the
That's
places
now.
where,
But Islamic culture now is also a little distorted from what Islamic culture was during the heyday of Islam.
right, it's a carryover.
Well, but no, my point is that much of Islam, the way we think of it now, has actually narrowed from what was a very open, engaged intellectual community, which engaged both genders.
Never heard of any woman who wrote anything.
You're not going to. If you're looking for literary output, you're gonna be at a loss. But don't confuse lack of literary output with a lack of participation
Yeah.
in the intellectual activity
Okay.
of the era.
And someone I knew and when I used to work with used to always quote, said that if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So if they weren't able to write, or someone wrote about them or what they said, then what happened then with all these women who were attending all these
We have these various stories that percolate around, but they're stories that place them in a normative context. In other words, the husband who says to the Shunammite woman, he's not saying, why are you going to do this, as if this was an abnormal activity. What he finds abnormal is the fact that she's doing it on Tuesday instead of on Shabbat. Right? So that the normative activity was you went to do this, right? I think there was a greater degree of inclusion than we sometimes posit, because there was a marginalization that took place over time. So if you, for example, in the Middle Ages, it was, as a matter of halacha, totally permissible for women to read the Megillah for the community. Go back to the 14th century, that's the rule. What happens by the 16th, 17th century? Sorry, ladies, go to the back of the bus. Or better yet, don't even bother getting on the bus because it doesn't matter what you do, right? So I think we have to be both fair to the ancients that they may actually have been better than the middle period. And we, in some ways, are coming back to a better phenomenon.
I'm not trying to be unfair to men or of the ancients. I'm just trying to understand how this could come about, that what a person would say, well, don't talk to your wife, or don't engage in small talk. Okay, we shouldn't engage in lashon hara, gossip.
Lashon hara is not saying lashon hara.
What is the small talk then?
I don't know what it is, but if he meant lashon hara, he would have said it. That was a concept, right?
Okay, we call it gossip then.
Well, gossip is really different than lashon hara.
Okay, then what is the word for gossip?
Rechilut, usually.
Okay.
Right? Now, it's also a spectrum of discussion, right? I remember when I was in rabbinical school, my roommate and I read a book by the Chafetz Chaim called Shmirat HaLashon, which literally means guarding your tongue. And for months, we had conversations that went like this. Did I tell you about, never mind. Did you hear? Forget it. Because what we realized was so much of our ordinary conversation kind of fell into this. We weren't being nasty about anybody. And we weren't necessarily sharing something that was hurtful or derogatory, but it was a lot about stuff that happened, but not to us necessarily.
Could it have been fake news?
No, not then. This was more
concept of repeating something that you have no substantiation.
This was more the stuff that, let me tell you what Yankel did in class today. Right? That was not hearsay. That was not made up. It was not fictionalized. It was, I saw Yankel did this in class today. And maybe it was funny. Right? But even though it's funny, is that, should I be talking about Yankel at all? Right? Because when does talking about Yankel to say that Yankel did something funny become talking about Yankel in a more mocking, derogatory, where he's less the author of the funny and more the target of the funny?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very slippery kind of slope. And so I don't want to sort of, because I do want to get to the end of the Mishnah, but I think we have to sort of recognize that there's a spectrum of engagement and activity that ebbs and flows in different societies at different times. The cottage industry and the women who went to the markets and to the marketplaces, whether it was to sell eggs or milk or homemade products, was a real thing. Right? Because if we isolated them that much, there is no venue in which I have to worry about engaging them in conversation because I don't have contact with them. Okay. Now, I want to just give you two more people and then sort of bring it to the Mishnah to an end, right? The Meiri, Menachem ben Shlomo, was a famous medieval Provençal rabbi who was a halachic authority and a Talmudist, and he writes a commentary to the Talmud, including one to the tractate of Avot, though much of his material was not available until until sometime in the 19th century. So he was like on the side for a while, and then people discovered him, and it's like, wow, this guy's really insightful and thoughtful, blah, blah. He became very popular, right? So he writes essentially, and I'm paraphrasing because he's right about this big. One should limit conversation to those that are necessary about household finances and expenditures and avoid non-essential discourse. It's a very pragmatic kind of thing that, because he's trying to sort of show that when it says sicha, it doesn't mean substantive discussion, it means frivolous discussion, but that you should engage your spouse when dealing with matters of the household. Right? Because that was, if not exclusively their realm, it was very much their realm of control, and therefore you should engage them in conversation when dealing with those matters. And with other things, it best not talk to them too much. In some ways, he is the inverse to some degree of Abravanel, because Abravanel said, don't talk to them about matters of hospitality and tzedakah and finance and household runnings. And the Meiri is basically saying, no, those are exactly the things that you should talk to your spouse about. Everything else, no. Right? Now, to what degree is the Meiri, who lives in the late 13th, early 14th century, reflecting some of the norms of his own reality in Provence? Weiß nicht. I don't know French society of that era well enough, but I imagine that that's part of it. Right? Plus, it's at least now, the last two are sort of connecting it to the previous parts of the statement. I'm dealing with making the house wide open and having lots of guests. I'm talking about bringing poor people in, whether as employees or as guests. All right? And therefore, household finances are a really relevant piece. And Abravanel is saying, don't talk to them because they're not going to wanna, either because it's a drain on the household or a lot of extra work. And the Meiri is going like, no, these are the conversations you really have to have, because otherwise you can't do it properly. Okay. Before I give you the last one, I'll just share with you that Gordon Tucker, with regard to this particular Mishnah, writes the following. The third part of this Mishnah presents us with a manifestly misogynistic point of view. Right? Which would not have been out of sync with major currents in the Hellenistic world in which Yosef ben Yochanan lived.
That's what I said.
It is. I'm not sure that I completely agree with him, because I think there are too many exceptions to the rule. But we certainly hear it as an incredibly misogynistic comment. Okay? And I say that because that leads to our last sage for the day, which is Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, born in 1808, died in 1888. Hirsch was a German Orthodox rabbi who was the intellectual founder of a doctrine called Torah im Derech Eretz, Torah with the way of the land, which was a school of philosophy which is the underpinning of neo-Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy today. And it formalized a relationship between traditional observance of Judaism and the modern world, which, by the way, could be said to be true of the nascent Reform movement and the conservative movement that grew out of the Reform movement. Right? They're all trying to find the balance point between the traditional observance of Judaism and the reality of modernity. And the debate is usually about degree and detail, more so than anything else. Okay. That said, Hirsch was a vehement and vocal opponent of the nascent reform movement in the 1800s, and was not a big fan of Zecharia Frankel and some of the others who would become the intellectual birthers of the conservative movement, even though it did not exist by that nomenclature at that point in time. Right? But I share with you what Hirsch writes in his commentary to this Mishnah. We are not told tarbeh dvarim or al tidaber harbe, do not talk too much with your wife. As a matter of fact, he notes, the sayings of the sages are replete with maxims stressing the high esteem in which womanhood should be held, the respect and honor due one's wife, and particularly the great importance that a husband should attach to the views, opinions, and counsel of his wife. Right? Now, Hirsch is correct, but one could probably rally a great many maxims and statements of the sages which are the inverse of what he just said. Right? But essentially, part of what he's starting with is don't get upset. All right. And then he goes on. And especially in this context, where we have just read about the virtues of helpfulness, charity, kindness, and hospitality, which should emanate from the home and hence are so greatly dependent on the work and cooperation of the wife, the statement immediately following should certainly not be construed in a way derogatory to her, despite what it sounds like. Right? He's trying to fudge a little bit, but he's also trying to make it connected to what came before, which at least I think is an essential. In fact, he goes on, this very statement may well be founded on genuine appreciation of the vital role played by both husband and wife in the discharge of the tasks to be fulfilled by the home. Right? Now, before you say, I remind you that Hirsch can point to a tremendous amount of rabbinic commentary from the Hellenistic era and beyond, in which the role of Abraham and Sarah is touted as co-equal. So it's not like he's coming at this from nowhere. He can point to all of this midrashic tradition that says, yeah, Abraham was doing this and Sarah was doing that as partners in creating an open home and a place where they could teach about their belief in God. Hirsch continues, a man who truly respects his wife will have more to offer her than just trivial talk and idle chatter for her amusement. He will want to discuss with her the serious concerns of life and will derive enjoyment from the resulting exchange of views and counsel. It's a fascinatingly modern statement. All right. Remember, he's saying this 150 plus years ago. So it's just a fascinating statement. And then he sort of goes to, and the gloss that talks about other women and blah, 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 he has to deal with that as well because it's in front of him. Moreover, engaging in trifling talk with other women and other men's wives may imperil moral purity. In other words, we've come back to that concern again. From these passages was derived this maxim, according to which indulgence in more idle chatter than is seemly, even with one's own household, may gravely jeopardize the spirit of earnest duty and study to which life should be consecrated. Right? So after that very, very lengthy, I'll call it ode to women and spouses, he sort of circles back to, yeah, but they're still got to be worried about temptation and stuff like that. and frivolous behavior. And I can't ignore the gloss that talks about, you're getting distracted from Torah study and doing other frivolous things. All right, so it's just a fascinating process of how each of them is trying to make sense of this statement, plus the gloss, plus the commentary to the gloss, which built this up and in some ways distorted it, and at the same time tries very dutifully to figure out what is this, how is this the third part of this tripartite statement. So that's today's Mishnah in all its
Thank you. That was good.
What was-